afternoon, or good evening rather. This is the conclusive part of this first forum day. The format is going to be slightly different. We don't have any presentations, but we will try and sort of look at what was best expressed in the course of this long, dense day, which was focusing on geopolitics, finance, and we do all this with the ex-ambassador, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, great knowledgeable expert of Italy and of this part of Europe, of our country, and of the immense Russian Federation. We will do the same with Professor Antonio Fallico, who at this time of the day no longer needs to be introduced, and we should rather stress that he is always committed in doing more and doing better in order to facilitate politics whenever the political arena is affected by a serious crisis, which is the one that has been affecting us in the last years, and even more so in the last year and a half. And then the director of DG Com24, Alessandro Banfi, and he will be covering this event, but we will also try and have a quick round of the table in trying to see what are the impressions gathered and picked up during the day. Now, Deputy Minister Mishkov, can you tell us what are the interesting aspects that you picked up during the day, and what's important and what's happening in between the relations at international level? Many thanks. Today was really a very interesting and dense day, dense of interesting things. I'm sure that tomorrow will be just the same. But in the course of this day, we have had some panels which once again have proven that the forum is a fact, and it's also evolving. It's evolving in the sense that the number of participants is growing, the theme and the focus is expanding, meaning by this that this forum is keeping up with times. This is something very, very rare, I would say. The previous editions of this forum were mostly devoted to foreign politics and foreign policies, but at that time I know that we were once used to saying that the relations between Russia and the European Union were resting upon economic links and connections and not on politics, but we've been proven wrong because we couldn't at that time envisage that the attempts to bring back the world to the unipolar times, we would never think or believe that this is something that could happen once again, but it did. And this is also ignoring the socio-economic interest of people. Who could ever benefit from this? I don't know. This was well proven by our forum, and we can definitely say that neither Russia nor European Union will ever earn anything nor have any benefits out of all this. I know that the possibility of reading the positive aspects of the very last evolutions of this very complex geopolitical evolution, which has got to do with what happened recently. We've had the Russian mediation to negotiate the agreement with the nuclear energy in Iran. There was an involvement of Russia, which was somewhat contested, but also acknowledged on the arena that seemed to be ungovernable of the one of Syria. And Putin, President Putin, today announced that we will soon have the so much wanted informations as the maps or the mapping of the ISIS locations and hideouts. And then there is another aspect which is growing up, which is an emergency, the one of Afghanistan, with the many Euro-Asian perspectives, which once again sees the Western world, the Western forces, NATO, Russia, and also another contamination aspect, which envisages a number of factors whereby we understand that there could be a hope for an improvement in the dialogue, especially as far as the situation of the conflict in Ukraine. Now, in this context, Professor Follico, the opportunity which was represented for the Euro-Asian opportunity. Now, the economy which is sparing the politics of understanding. Can you say something about that? Well, today, many speakers during this conference, during this forum, have been underlining a number of things. Minister Boschi said that we don't want to have any barriers, and if there are going to be barriers, we will build bridges. This is something that brings me back to reality. The reality is that there is truly a slowing down at geopolitical level. I'd say pressures whereby a siege has been made against Russia, and I think that many governments understood that there is no international dossier that could be regulated without involving Russia. You were mentioning the entire Iran issue, the Libya, Syria, and to Libya I could add Africa. I could say that all of them are emergencies, epochal emergencies, and no nation alone on a standalone basis can solve them nor regulate them. I believe that this is very important. Now, obviously, sanctions will be lifted soon, hopefully, but I believe that the rhetoric of sanctions will come to an end. And sometimes there are some explicit interests in, once again, imposing them. And this is what sometimes may help exchanges. There are so many Cassandras, and somehow the Cassandras have to go back to some forecasts.
And the catastrophe, luckily enough, did not occur. GDP is going to be negative, but it'll be 3.2, 3.5%. The last quarter, and many analysts say so, it is not my own idea, there's going to be a positive sign, maybe 0.3, 0.4, and this makes us understand that there is some trust still there, because the problem of sanctions is that it did away with all the trust that existed between our two countries. So the counter sanctions in the with the food products in the food industry were certainly not the reaction to sanctions. Certainly the price of the barrel fell, and this has certainly I think it is 48.2 now, so certainly this does have repercussions, but the sanctions, the loss of trust as such sanctions being imposed immediately after the will is expressed by the Russian Federation to build together, or these sanctions that were imposed again unidirectionally had a devastating effect. Companies were brought to a halt. Companies weren't believing anymore in their own economy, and not even an economy of the Eurasian countries, of the small Eurasia, because then we I've also talked about the large Eurasia, the political space that includes all what lies between Lisbon and Vladivostok. Alexei Mishukov and Gozzi and the President of Ministers here, of the Italian ministers, Mrs. Boschi, and tomorrow Mrs. Guidi, and then on the Russian side we already heard the two ministers of the Economic Euro Committee. Tomorrow we're going to hear from Denis Manturov, Minister for Trade and Industry in Russia. Then Minister Sokolov, Minister for Transport, is also going to take the floor. And this tells us that there is a new awareness on the part of our country, Italy, to re-establish constructive ties and relationship with Russia. So this basically paves the way to a new hope, and I wish that the companies here represented could grasp the opportunity as given by these 2 days so as to be bold enough and independent and start business again based on what we established here, on the building on the historical relationship that we've always had, both culturally and economically, between Italy and Russia. Russia is the driving engine, both of a small Eurasia and of the large Eurasia. Thank you very much, Professor Fallico. So certainly you give a good interpretation of the latest events. Mr. Banfi followed the different editions of the forum over the past few years. So as a journalist, I like to invite him to be short in identifying what is different between today and the previous editions or the previous years. Well, the first thing to say, in my perspective, is that the Italian government, as the government by Mr. Renzi, has showed certainly greater attention. Indeed, he has sent Gozzi, Mrs. Guidi, Mrs. Boschi. So this is an important sign. So there's a greater attention being devoted to this meeting on the side of the Italian government. I believe that this is important for the Italian businessmen and for the Russian delegates alike. The problem of the Euro-Asiatic relationship is of such importance for Italy as well as for Russia. Now, as for the content, well, Minister Boschi this morning said we are working at our reform process, so we want to say this to the foreign companies here represented. Then each of us as Italian have our own opinions, but as an Italian, I for myself felt proud of our government finally realizing that important things are being said at this forum, that important people feature here, that things are being said that are not said elsewhere. Now, to go back to what was said today, I believe that the debate on energy is fantastic. I would have listened for 2 more hours to Professor Simonia to talk about shale gas, because this is indeed what makes you understand things. Because if you read in deep down, you may actually understand what happens. Especially us of the newspapers, but this is true also for all observers and all citizens. So the first piece of news, I think, is to identify this different attitude on the part of our government vis-à-vis this forum. The international climate has also changed. The Corriere della Sera this morning had showed a piece of news, or a picture rather, stating that the President Putin lies at the center of a number of key situations. Well, a year ago the situation was quite different. President Putin was identified very much as the villain a year ago. But now the situation, the climate, the atmosphere has changed. The sanctions are still on, the rhetoric on sanctions has changed. And that page on the first page of the Corriere della Sera made me think again about the different atmosphere that we breathe, the different air that we breathe here at the Forum. And then the third image is that of Igor Sechin, saying that Rosneft is investing over heavily in new investments. So basically, he was saying to all the delegates here, to all the Italian companies, that there's a lot of investment being made available, and he basically is inviting entrepreneurs to come up with ideas. I believe that there are plenty of opportunities. This is another thing that I wish to say. At the TGCOM, we talked about the Moon 27 project, Europe and Russia together in the aerospace industry. Well, this is an industry where we're very strong in Italy, because this is the typical excellence in Italy, the typical where Italy again is doing very well and holding again a cooperation project with Russia. Then a reference was made to gas in Nord Stream, and as a matter of fact, he also said that the German was very strict with imposing sanctions, and then for some reason they are the first to sign an agreement. What is happening after 2019 to Italian gas then? So this is what has always happened in the European Union. So everybody basically following different routes, following changing winds, as it were, because again, decision change on a weekly basis. Now, Minister Meshkov, Deputy Minister Meshkov, there are things, as Professor Fallico and Alessandro Banfi were saying, who basically make us feel much less pessimistic than we were just a few days ago.
Let me get started with what I ended with. So let me say that the situation that was created was to the detriment of Russia. It's not instrumental to the relations that are Italo-Russian relations, but this doesn't mean that we have to stay put. Our forum is rightly, as we said, a way to try and find a way out together, a way out of the situation that exists. Today, it is clear to everyone that we can only oppose the real problems, such as we can together fight terrorism. And as we said, the solution of the nuclear problem, Iran nuclear problem, which saw the joint work of many of us and the need to find a solution to Libya's problems, Yemen problems, Afghanistan problems. You did mention Afghanistan, and we know that the situation is not at all rosy. There are a number of international problems, and we have to work together. Now, going back to what we were saying, I would like to say that in Russia we appreciate the pragmatic approach that was characteristic of this situation, and that exists as far as we are concerned. So we know that in Moscow they heard about the declaration of Minister Renzi on August 25th in Rimini, when Prime Minister Renzi was talking about recent entrance to the new European Union, and I'm referring right now to a situation whereby we are having talks with Brussels to try and find a situation and a solution to this. But Russia has an initiative, which is President Putin's initiative, which is aiming at creating an economic humanitarian space extending from the Atlantic to Vladivostok. And I believe that this was the proposal made by the Euro-Asian Commission to the European one, exactly on this topic. Now, if we will be successful in creating this common area, this common space, we will forget the problems that we are fighting today. That is, when countries like Ukraine are confronted with the choice of deciding whom to side with. We would want all of the European countries to be with us, both the ones in the European Union and the ones that are part of the Euro-Asian Union, and at the same time those that do not belong to any other union. Our idea is this one. So many thanks to Vice Minister, Deputy Minister Mishkov. Now, Alessandro Banfi, from the journalistic point of view, I'd like to say that there have been two statements that were really hitting me. The first one was the one made by President Prodi, who substantially said that Europe, and somehow, to some extent, Russia as well, are running the risk of becoming the weak link in the long chain that starts off from innovation, where the leader is in the hands of the USA and also somehow in the hands of China. Do you agree with this idea that we may wear the clothes of the third parties? Now, I believe that from Lisbon to Vladivostok, in this distance, there has to be some understanding of the fact that we are confronted with the euro crisis affecting our currency, affecting the very foundations of this union. And as you probably know, there is sort of a metastatic spread of anti-European parties across Europe. There seems to be another aspect, which is immigration-oriented, which shows how many difficulties exist in Europe. There is an obvious political issue because the economic union has generated a monetary union, which is not yet a political union. So I do truly like the idea of a common area, common space. I believe that the idea of this common space is probably the most fruitful of Europe, and the Europe that all of the Europeans want is the one of origins, which pragmatically is born as a common market. Now, the Europe which is not having any success in our own consciences is the one where there is a top-down kind of regulation which comes from Brussels. I believe that the weak link in the chain so the point and the issue is that Europeans have to go back to the idea of a common space. And from this point of view, the relations and the relations with Putin, together with the challenge of Eurasia, which spans from Lisbon down and reaches out to Vladivostok, is once again renewing the idea of an authentic and true common area. That's the very fruitful idea, the one of the square, which is where we all meet, the meeting point, where there is no longer the have and the have-nots, the blacks and the whites, the north, the people from the north and the people from the south. I believe that this is a way to make up for today's dimension, and this is what would inevitably allow us to make up for this crushing situation, and this is what should allow us to have a country of opportunities and of freedom, which comes along with the many positive things. I was struck by the discourse that was delivered by Pope Francis to the American Congress, because that's where the Pope talked about values that are shared by the entire world. Freedom, religious freedom, the one of enterprise, of the melting point, of all of us being people, having no difference in terms of race, religion, or gender. And our values, these values, may be lost in a vision of financial capitalism, which is very much instrumental, where there is only Wall Street and where there is only the factory of slaves in China. The world cannot be represented by the financial capitalism of Wall Street and those who have no rights because there are no environmental benchmarks or trade union benchmarks and rights, and the slaves that live in the new Middle East. And in this sense, Europe and Russia have a great perspective, and we've seen this, we've heard this, which is also cultural, which is also entailing creativity, business opportunities, new judgments, historical judgments, and the many stories that we've heard today. So a nostalgic comeback to a sense of the community in Europe, a nostalgic come back to the origins of the American Constitution, the list of freedoms that sometimes trips into the daily praxis and procedure, although it still fascinates us. Professor Fallico, in conclusion, we've heard another strong stimulus from one of the most strategic companies, national companies, Finmeccanica, and when he said that we must be careful because they are changing the connotations of the investment. Initially, we were looking for delocalization under the banner of identity. Now, instead, the competition is looking for localization under the banner of quality. And this is for those who want to support and sustain the enterprise and the economic penetration. And this is even more true in a context which is the one of the Chinese-affected East. So what are the tools available to us to confront with a strategy which is a winning strategy currently? Finmeccanica had some proposals, and I believe that they have been seen positively by Finmeccanica itself. I believe that this is very important, and the agreements that were entered with Sistiti Technologi that were recently concluded together with Rosneft are agreements that are very important, and quite clearly the importance of these agreements has to be shared. And this delocalization, as you call it, is subject to generate in Russia a situation whereby we no longer can be convinced that Russia is only selling gas, oil, and raw materials, but maybe no one else knows that there is an incredible intellectual potential, and that in terms of patents, qualitative patents, it's even exceeding China. And when we see the Premier Medvedev says that we can export raw materials and that we could mostly try and consider all this, that's exactly what he meant. Finmeccanica has understood what the opportunity is now. And then there is another thing that happens in the energy field. I believe and I agree partially with what Prodi says. He says that there have been incredible sanctions imposed by Germany mostly, but probably we haven't sufficiently evaluated the lukewarm reaction of our own state businesses and sectoral businesses in the face of the reiterated request of Gazprom. So the war, the businesses and the enterprises can be done with those who accept, with those who are there, not with the ones we imagine will accept. And quite clearly, in their own hard lines, the Germans were proving a higher pragmatic approach. And quite clearly, the second tranche of the Nord Stream is falling within the wake of their own availability of doing business, notwithstanding sanctions.
Notwithstanding the sanction, notwithstanding the environment that had been created, politics can be flexible. This can be useful. President Prodi stated that this can be also an incentive for our own company. It is 7:15. We are just 15 minutes late after 30-40 people taking the floor. I'd like to thank you all, starting with the Deputy Minister Meshkova, to Professor Fallico, Alessandro Banfi, is the Director of TGCOM24. Thank you very much for being with us. Tomorrow we'll meet all at 9. Thank you.